Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Today is Sunday, so normally we would do a frontline update for you going across the front line, but to be honest, there is not much to talk about. Russians, despite their attacks, were not successful in almost any directions this week. It was one of the smallest advances that they've achieved at all, and none of them were particularly notable. Other than that, Ukrainian advances are continuing, and I did cover it in my last video. So instead of talking about the frontline situation, we're gonna additionally explore what is happening on the front line and how the war is changing, and specifically changing in favor of Ukraine. Let's begin. A lot of Western bloggers, even media, have picked up on Russian propagandists crying for the last couple of months about the Ukrainian attacks in depth to their positions. We did cover it a little bit in some of the previous videos, but the gist of the matter is that suddenly it seems that Ukrainians have increased their distance of attacks around the front line, and density of drones is also very high, and now Ukrainians are also utilizing some new weird tactics where they're using drones, and they even are able to counterattack against the Russian positions. And a lot of people are now wondering, how did this happen? Where did the changes come from? And thankfully on this channel, both you and I, we don't have the selective amnesia. We actually remember that in February last year, Ukrainian armed forces announced that they're creating a drone line project. Drone line project was there to provide a structural new approach to how to utilize drones on the front line. I'll remind for people that did forget, essentially it divided the front line into multiple zones, where you had zone number 1 where nothing is supposed to live, you had zone number 2 where any kind of major facilities and any kind of transportation was not supposed to be alive, and then you had the zone number 3 that was in depth to strike out any command posts and any kind of stockpiles of the occupiers, creating this kill zone front line that would not allow the occupiers to even think of approaching Ukrainian positions. And what we are seeing right now is just a continuous evolution of that project. Back then, I said that Russians should be extremely afraid that when they saw this picture, where we saw the commanders of some of the best Ukrainian drone battalions at that time come together, put their heads together to find out the best way to work forward, that this could potentially create an absolutely nightmare situations for the Russians. This has happened in some incremental steps, and some people that did not follow the evolution of the drone warfare potentially missed it, and now they're surprised that Ukraine is suddenly having an advantage on the front line. So let's quickly jump into the paint and talk about what specifically has changed. Some notable changes happened last year. Most notable change was that if before there was more or less understood front line that was one side controlled by Ukrainians, other side by Russians, it became blurred. And instead, we are now having about 15 kilometers one way, 15 kilometers the other way, like a big gray zone that is extremely densely saturated by both Ukrainian drones and also the Russian drones. And only some loosely formed small groups of men can actually move through that zone, and it's a pretty nightmare scenario for anything that doesn't follow that description. And this was where Ukrainians were actually criticized a lot, because despite the announcements about this drone line project, a lot of the ideas of the drone line project did not really materialize because the saturation was not there. We saw that Magyar was stating that number of forces that are able to use the drones were not sufficient to fully cover the front line, or even cover it to an extent that would allow significant control. More than that, we saw Russia actively joining the small skies game and getting a lot of their parts directly shipped to China, allowing them to build, while not the best drones, but Russia, just by the sheer quantity, just saturated a lot of the front line with those smaller drones. Especially was the innovation of the fiber optic drones. It's drones that have the fiber optic cable attached to them, and these drones were not susceptible to electronic warfare. This kind of put Ukraine in a little bit weird disadvantage, because while Ukrainian drones are better, the innovation drive in Ukraine is better, technology in Ukraine is better, but it just couldn't match what Russia was doing. And that was about the mid-year 2025, when a lot of people looked at the situation on the front line and actually stated, well, Russia seemingly is winning this drone game. Well, unfortunately for them, that was just the first stage. Because while Russia does have the advantage in quantity, they do not have the technological drive that I mentioned. And Ukraine, over the continuous months, has started saturating the front line with new examples of different drones. It will be drones that are flying on different frequencies. It is drones that are essentially repeater drones, drones that can receive the signal from the control terminal of the pilot and then send that signal further, allowing some of the drones to fly further along the enemy front line and actually target a lot of the behind-the-scenes targets that were not reachable beforehand. And more importantly, massive investments into Ukrainian drone sector has followed through. And now we saw Ukraine suddenly rolling out the ground vehicle drones, the ground vehicles that are able to launch FPV drones. They were able to launch the carrier drones that would have some FPV drones on them, the heavy bomber drones that would fly into the depth of the Russian ranks and start bombing. And we saw Ukrainian drones just innovate, and get that depth further and further and further into the Russian ranks. And Russians are trying to match that tempo, but they were always like one step behind Ukraine. There was always a little bit of delay between the Russians, but just the sheer quantity of Russian tools was still allowing them to move forward despite the Ukrainian advantage that was pretty obvious for anyone that was following along. The moment it became absolutely obvious what is happening on the front line was when the Ukrainian new Minister of Defense was able to negotiate with Elon Musk to shut off the Starlink operations on the front line for Russians, essentially just whitelisting the specific Starlinks that could be operated in Ukraine, which basically shut down a lot of the Russian copies of Ukrainian tech that they tried to put on the front line. And suddenly Russia was caught with their pants down, that they do not have actually their own technology or technological developments, and majority of what they're having is just very rough copies of what Ukraine is using, that they were able to assemble from the bulk Chinese components and cheap materials that they could acquire. A big example is while a lot of Ukrainian drones are built with like carbon frames, a lot of Russian drones are built with aluminum frames. And this is because aluminum is really, really cheap for Russians as they are a metal producer. So put a pin in this. This is the first big thing that Russia is right now struggling with. The technological advances of Ukrainians that were already setting the tempo, but Russia was just able to match. And now suddenly they just cannot match it. Then we go further. And this is where we get into the interesting part. Because while everyone was focusing on density of the frontline situation, specifically this initial frontline part where there was a lot of short-range drones flying and just destroying everything about 15 kilometers each way, Ukrainians saw that saturation of their drones on the frontline is already pretty nice. And as their technologies were developing, they entered the second stage of the drone line project, which is we now go for the second part. Now we're going for logistics, now we're going for radar stations and anti-air systems. And over the last half a year, we saw Ukrainians increasingly start hunting against the Russian anti-air systems that are launching the anti-air missiles, hunting for radar dishes that are trying to scan the horizon, and hunting for some kind of stockpiles or drone crews that were operating in the area, plus obviously destroying all of the transport that they could in that area. And these targets became more and more and more prevalent as Ukraine started developing technologies to not only have the dominance in the close frontline area, but something that is called middle strike. And we talked about this. What did change is a little bit the approach, because beforehand Ukraine was saturating the front line, and it was pretty understandable for the drones that are being used on the front line, because they need to be used all across the front line. This is the basis of Ukrainian modern defense. So you couldn't really have any kind of sophisticated tactics with these drones. You just had what you had. You need to use it everywhere. That is not the case for the second rank front line. This goes to about 100 to 150 kilometers, someone would say. This is the middle strike section. So in this middle strike, we now saw adaptation by Ukrainians. What Ukrainians started doing is they started doing a methodical campaigns of cutting out everything that Russia has in specific sectors. So Ukraine went from let's just destroy everything to let's now do territory control. And now suddenly at the start of this year, when Ukraine has a little bit of advantage, we suddenly see this approach materialize. To give an example, what Ukrainians would do, they would select the part of the front line that they would like to attack. It would be a pretty narrow path. And over that narrow path, over multiple days and potentially even weeks, they would have crews operate both in the close front line, but also in the middle strike direction. And they would be taking out all of the mentioned assets that I just stated. So all of the logistics, radio controls, drone crews, everything. And they would essentially shape the battlefield that would be susceptible to a potential Ukrainian counter-push. They would deploy a lot of the classical smokes, they would deploy all of the different other tactics, and they would then be able to advance, despite the fact that Russia is still having advantage on the front line with their saturated front line. Beforehand, we didn't know how one party can really advance with such a density on the front line. Now, Ukrainians, despite all of that, are actually able to perform quality offensive actions without just doing what Russia does by just sending countless waves of soldiers with the hopes that they will just get through and maybe the enemy drones will not notice them. And it is actually even worse with defense, because now this second part, as it's now being targeted by Ukrainians, this second part is becoming a big nightmare for Russians. A very common story that Russians would tell you is that if there is like a front line, and would be like a position that is right there at the front line, let's say like 1 kilometer away from the quote-unquote middle point, so some kind of position. So we know that this close range zone is about 15 kilometers. Russians, they would not be able to drive into that zone. So what they would do is they would load the Russian troops with some kind of supplies and everything, and then these guys would walk for these 14, 15 kilometers very, very slowly, crawling, maybe just doing a couple kilometers per day, just to get to that position at the front line where they would just basically dig into the ground and try to do something, or maybe try to assemble enough force so they can attack going further. That was the tactics that Russians were using. But you already see where the problem is. Because if this zone in defense is now going to get extended, if this was the 15 kilometers, if Ukrainians are going to start extending this further and further and further, and we know that about the edge is about 150 kilometers that Ukrainians are attacking. So if Russians will be forced to walk, 50 kilometers towards the front line, how are they even going to get there? And Russians don't really have capable infantry. All of their infantry is just very poorly trained, that they just are able to amass in large quantities and basically force them to just march into certain direction. This becomes a more and more complex battlefield for the Russians, which creates inability of them to move forward. Now, this zone obviously is still developing. This 15 to 150, the middle strike zone. Ukraine doesn't still have the density of the drones necessary to get Russians weeded out from these positions, but they are ahead and they are going after it. And right now, Ukrainians have a window of opportunity while Russians are catching up. And my expectations is that for the next half a year, we see Ukraine setting the tempo. And we will see, hopefully, Russians not only slow down their advances on the front line, but also suffer pretty horrible casualties trying to do so. They will adapt eventually. They will also scale up. So this will be also happening on the Ukrainian front lines. But right now, Ukraine has achieved a massive advantage on the front line, and they can definitely exploit it. But more importantly, something that should give you even more optimism is that this is all part of the bigger strategy of Ukraine. And that strategy is working. So Ukraine is following their outlined path, the path that is delivering result, the path that is already aiming to destroy over 50,000 Russians per month. And number by itself has been critiqued a lot, stating that obviously just destroying Russians is not going to bring you victory. True, but it is creating and basically stacking problems that Russia is having on the front line. Russia is solving a lot of their issues by the sheer quantity. So if Ukrainians are able to put more pressure for Russia to get that quantity sustained, this is what can drive Ukraine to dominate on the front line, because they are the one that are going to be defining the tempo on the front line. Putin really wants to fight this war comfortably, well, where he just wants to send some of his soldiers to slowly die on the front line and then maybe hope to find some weakness in the Europeans that would just look to just give Russia some leeway. Some people like Belgium's prime minister that is now proposing that we should again negotiate with Russia, which is, I don't know what we're supposed to negotiate, motivating it that we're not capable, we're weak in Europe and so on. I am sick and tired our politicians thinking that we are weak, pathetic and incapable. I want us to realize that we are strong and we can fight it and we can defeat Russia. Ukraine is doing this every day despite what Russia has been throwing at them and despite the pressure from the allies like these that are always trying to stall out Ukraine to the Russians. We are not like this in here on this channel, and my hopes are that you believe that as well. Support Ukraine, participate in our drone fundraiser. We're doing fantastically. We're going to support the Ukrainian armed forces and Ukraine will win. Trust in Ukraine, trust in Ukrainian armed forces. I love you. Slava Ukraini, and I will see you next time.